So we all know the story of Pavlov's dogs. Do you remember doing it at school? Pavlov had a number of dogs. He'd ring the bell, then he'd bring the dogs out for their food. And then after a time he noticed, that the food would arrive, dogs would salivate, they'd get excited. And then what he noticed was after a certain period of time, all he needed to do was ring the bell. Just ringing the bell got the dogs salivating. It didn't matter if any food arrived. So the idea is, he described this as, in terms of psychology, if you want to know, he described it as classic conditioning, and that the dogs were conditioned by the bell. So we always do this at school. I always kind of wonder, why do they bother telling us that? Just because dogs salivate when the bell rings? But there's a lot we can take from this. Think about yourself. Think about how you're conditioned. How are you conditioned the way the dogs are? Are there behaviours, things you do where basically you're kind of on automatic pilot? When you finish dinner, do you walk towards the fridge to see if there's any chocolate in there? Obviously I don't. It's terrible. I've had I remember different friends over the years. I remember one guy was saying that he would kind of walk home, he'd walk into his flat, pleased to be home at the end of the day. The first thing he'd do, he'd go into the kitchen. He wasn't particularly good at shopping. I don't know what he ate. Kind of go to the fridge. The only thing that was there was beer. So he'd end up having a can of beer when he got home, sat down with his can of beer, enjoyed relaxing. And then gradually, like, one became two became three, and suddenly realised, wait a minute, what's going on? And so he kind of changed his habit, went back to one. So that's a nice example of how he was kind of conditioned. He'd walk home, go to the fridge, what was in the fridge, and then you start sort of drinking it. I had a couple of friends over the years. I've never smoked, I'll be honest, so maybe I don't understand the addiction. And I remember, like, one girl I worked with, she would sort of say, I'm rushing around, I have to go and clean my horse out in the morning, muck my horse out, take it for a ride in the evening, I'll rush home, and then I kind of cook dinner. And she was sort of saying that she would enjoy a cigarette because she sat down to have the cigarette. She would actually stop to have a cigarette. Another guy, another friend of mine that I worked with, he would sort of go home. He said he never smoked all during the day, but he'd kind of go home, sit down and relax, and he'd have a cigarette. And again, the cigarette kind of gradually turned into sort of like half a pack, maybe a pack, and he would sort of smoke all the way through the evening. It was sort of only then when we talked about it, it wasn't the smoking that he enjoyed, it wasn't the smoking that she enjoyed, it was the actual act of sitting down, having a little break. And again, sort of changing your breathing. Breathing's very, very important. Maybe if you do feel a bit stressed, maybe to sit down and relax. Just practice your breathing, concentrate on that, and you'll get the same sort of change of state that maybe you're looking for from your cigarette or your beer. And let's be honest, it's tough to argue that beer and cigarettes is the best way to relax long term, for your health, for your well-being. I sound as though I'm an absolutely mental driver. I always talk about getting angry in the car, but I don't get that angry. I've managed my chimp, I've changed my behaviour. But one of those things is the association. Sometimes you can reach a certain point in the road, or you get in the car and you start to kind of feel angry, stressed. You're kind of conditioned. Just by reaching a certain point in the road, you feel conditioned, you get angry. Think about that. It's maybe sort of something long term you don't want to do. Maybe it's all right to let off a bit of steam, but that might be something. Think about it as an example of how we're kind of conditioned. Think about how conditioning works in the workplace. I'm a teacher and I'm aware of this idea of conditioning. And I often sort of say, first class, okay, maybe some students come in, full of energy, they're excited, first day of term, everyone wants to make a good impression, everyone's excited. But there are some students, maybe in the first week I can see it. Students will come in and, their shoulders, shoulders are slumped, heads down. Really, they don't look very happy to be there. And at first, sort of taking this a little bit personally. But then I sort of think, well, I get it when they're 18, 19. They've been studying English for about 10 years. They've had lots and lots of English teachers. And it's just, I'm the next one on the treadmill for them. It's not very exciting. Oh no, I've got to do some more English, here we go again. You can see they're conditioned to sort of think, this is going to be painful, I don't want to do this, I've done this before, I don't want to do it again. So for the first 2 weeks, I always set out to try and make it fun, try and make it enjoyable. So I'll do some interactive exercises, try and make them enjoy it, change their conditioning. You need to try and change the conditioning, for example, if you're a teacher, but also at work. Think about maybe meetings that you go to. How do you feel when you're going into them? Are you sort of conditioned to think, oh, this is going to be awful? You know, why do I have to do this? If you're kind of, maybe you're going to a sales meeting, a sales pitch, and you're going to meet someone that you've met a couple of times before, and you're already going in with a losing mentality. You're conditioned to say no. You expect it. And often, if you expect someone to say no, you know, it's just you play a little game and they say no to you. You're conditioned to be rejected, conditioned to go in with a negative attitude, and it's not going to help. Maybe once in a blue moon it might pay off, but you know, long term, think about your conditioning, think about when you're conditioned, and think about what you can do to change that. Listen, have a great day, take care.